January 22nd, 1978. Saint Leonard, Montreal. The click of shuffled cards, the scrape of chairs on worn linoleum. Paolo Violi settled into his usual seat, back to the door, a position he'd occupied 1,000 times before. Outside, the temperature had dropped to minus 15 Celsius. Inside, the espresso machine hissed. The fluorescent light flickered once. A shadow moved behind the kitchen entrance. Then 3 gunshots shattered the quiet of the winter evening. Violi slumped forward, blood pooling beneath the playing cards. His killers disappeared into the Montreal night before his coffee went cold. The Calabrian Mafia's grip on Canada's second-largest city died with him that night, and what followed would reshape organized crime across an entire nation. But this execution wasn't spontaneous violence. It was the culmination of a carefully orchestrated war that had been building for nearly a decade, a conflict rooted not in personal vendetta, but in ethnic identity, business philosophy, and the fundamental question of who would control one of North America's most lucrative criminal empires. To understand why Paolo Violi had to die, you have to go back to a time when Montreal's underworld operated under a different set of rules, when the Calabrian Old Guard still believed their power was unassailable, and when a quiet Sicilian immigrant from Corleone was beginning to build something that would outlast them all. Montreal in the early 1970s was a city of 1.6 million people, built on an island where the St. Lawrence and Ottawa rivers converged. The port handled cargo from across the Atlantic. Immigration from Italy had swelled the population of neighborhoods like Saint Leonard and Rivière de Prairie. Men who'd left post-war poverty in Calabria and Sicily now ran construction companies, restaurants, and social clubs. Some ran something else entirely. The city's Italian community had become the infrastructure for what law enforcement would later document as one of the most sophisticated organized crime operations in Canadian history. Vincenzo Cotroni controlled that infrastructure. Born in Calabria in 1911, he'd arrived in Canada as a young man and built his empire with methodical patience. By 1970, Cotroni's organization touched every major racket in Montreal. Loan sharking that charged exorbitant weekly interest, compounding rapidly and turning manageable debts into financial traps within months. Illegal gambling operations that ran craps games, card rooms, and bookmaking services across the city. Protection rackets targeting immigrant business owners who understood that a monthly payment was cheaper than vandalism. Cotroni's power wasn't flamboyant. He drove a modest car, lived in a middle-class neighborhood, and rarely raised his voice. But every street-level operator knew that defying Cotroni meant facing consequences that arrived without warning. His strength came from 2 sources. First, his connection to the Bonanno crime family in New York, one of the 5 families that dominated American organized crime. The Bonannos recognized Cotroni as their Canadian representative, which gave him legitimacy and access to networks stretching from New York to Florida. Second, his absolute control over his own organization through his brother Frank and his trusted lieutenant Paolo Violi. Violi was the enforcer, the problem solver, the man who made sure everyone understood the cost of disloyalty. Born in Calabria in 1931, Violi had immigrated to Canada in 1951 and risen through the ranks with a combination of intelligence and controlled brutality. He operated from a café in Saint Leonard that served espresso to legitimate customers and functioned as the operational headquarters for Cotroni family business. If you needed to pay tribute, negotiate a dispute, or receive instructions, you went to Paolo Violi's establishment, and you showed respect. But in 1954, another immigrant arrived from Italy. Nicolo Rizzuto landed in Montreal with his wife and young son, coming not from Calabria, but from Sicily, specifically from Corleone. a town that would later gain global infamy through fiction, but had already produced generations of real mafiosi. Rizzuto was 40 years old, quiet, careful, and connected to Sicilian mafia families that operated with different principles than their Calabrian counterparts. Initially, Rizzuto worked within the Cotroni structure. He paid respect, he took orders, he built a modest construction business as a legitimate front. But he also began to build something else, a network of Sicilian associates who shared his background, his language, and his vision for what organized crime could become. By the early 1970s, that vision was becoming clear, and it was fundamentally incompatible with Cotroni's old world approach. The Calabrians focused on traditional rackets, gambling, loan sharking, protection that generated steady local income but required constant enforcement and carried high visibility. The Sicilians saw a different opportunity emerging. The international drug trade was evolving rapidly. While the Cotroni organization maintained its focus on established operations, the Rizzuto faction began positioning itself to exploit new trafficking opportunities that would prove far more lucrative than anything the traditional rackets could generate. The economic potential wasn't just incrementally better. It represented a fundamental shift in how organized crime could operate and profit. Nicolo Rizzuto and his son Vito, now a sharp, ambitious man in his 20s, began building relationships and networks that would later dominate Montreal's criminal economy. They used their construction companies as legitimate fronts. They leveraged their Sicilian connections to establish international relationships. They built credibility with suppliers who appreciated their professionalism and reliability. And they began positioning themselves for what would become the explosive growth of cocaine trafficking in the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s. The Sicilians weren't just competing with the Calabrians. They were preparing to operate in a different economic universe. This created a problem that went beyond business rivalry. In traditional mafia structures, subordinates owed tribute to their superiors. Rizzuto had initially operated under Cotroni's umbrella, which meant he owed a percentage of his earnings to the organization. But as the Sicilian faction's ambitions and operations grew, that percentage represented an increasingly burdensome obligation. Payments flowing upward to men who weren't taking the risks, weren't building the new relationships, and weren't adapting to the emerging criminal economy. From Rizzuto's perspective, paying tribute to Cotroni meant subsidizing obsolete leadership. From Cotroni's perspective, the Sicilians were refusing their obligations and undermining the hierarchy that kept organized crime functional. The tension manifested first in subtle ways: missed meetings, delayed payments, disputes over territory that used to be resolved with a conversation. Then it manifested in violence. Pietro Sciarra, a Calabrian who tried to mediate between the factions, was found dead in his car in 1976, shot execution style behind the left ear. Sciarra had attempted to bridge the growing divide between Calabrian and Sicilian factions, trying to negotiate an accommodation that would preserve organizational unity. His murder eliminated the possibility of peaceful resolution. The message was clear. Neutrality was no longer an option. You were with the Calabrians or with the Sicilians, and choosing wrong meant death. Paolo Violi understood this. He'd risen to power as Cotroni's enforcer precisely because he understood that organizational strength required harsh responses to disrespect. When the Rizzuto faction began operating with increasing independence, Violi saw it as an existential threat that demanded elimination. He started pushing Vincenzo Cotroni to authorize a purge of the Sicilian faction, strike decisively against Nicolo Rizzuto and his key associates, crush the rebellion before it metastasized. But Vincenzo Cotroni hesitated. He was in his 60s now, increasingly concerned about law enforcement attention. The Commission d'Enquête sur le Crime Organisé, CICO, had launched investigations into Montreal organized crime beginning in 1974, with public hearings generating extensive documentation throughout 1975 and 1976. Wiretaps were everywhere. Public violence would bring scrutiny that could destroy the entire organization. Cotroni wanted to negotiate to find accommodation, to preserve the structure he'd spent decades building. That hesitation was fatal. While Vincenzo Cotroni sought diplomatic solutions, the Rizzuto faction was preparing for war. They understood that the Calabrians had superior numbers and decades of institutional power. A direct confrontation would be suicide, but a surgical campaign, eliminating key leaders in rapid succession, could decapitate the organization before it could respond. The violence began to escalate through the mid-1970s. Lower-level associates on both sides were targeted. Territory disputes turned deadly. The careful equilibrium that had governed Montreal organized crime for decades was collapsing, and Paolo Violi found himself at the center of the storm. Violi fortified his position. He varied his routines, traveled with protection, and ran his operations from his café in Saint Leonard, where he controlled the environment. He still believed his power was real, that his reputation provided armor, that the Calabrian organization would rally to eliminate the Sicilian threat. He couldn't see what was actually happening, that the ground beneath him had already shifted, that younger members of his own organization were questioning whether the old guard could win this war, that the emerging drug economy the Sicilians were positioning themselves to control was changing the calculus of loyalty. The future belonged to whoever could control the most lucrative criminal markets, and those markets were moving beyond the traditional rackets that had sustained the Calabrians for decades. Then came January 22nd, 1978. Violi sat down at his card table in his café's back room, a space he considered as safe as his own home. He'd been there hundreds of times. The routine was comfortable, familiar. Cards, espresso, conversation with men he'd known for years. The gunman entered through the kitchen. 3 shots. Paolo Violi died instantly, slumped forward across the playing cards, his blood soaking into the cheap tablecloth. The killing was precise, professional, and utterly devastating to Calabrian morale. Violi wasn't just an enforcer, he was the symbol of Calabrian power, the man who'd built his reputation on the principle that disrespect would be answered with overwhelming violence. If he could be killed in his own territory, in his own establishment, while surrounded by his own people, then nowhere was safe. The psychological impact on the Calabrian organization was immediate. Fear replaced confidence. Paranoia replaced routine. Men who'd operated openly for years started varying their schedules, sleeping in different locations, wondering who among their associates might be passing information to the Sicilians. Vincenzo Cotroni was devastated personally and strategically. Violi had been his most trusted lieutenant, the enforcer who'd maintained order through sheer force of will. Without Violi, the Calabrian organization lacked its primary enforcement mechanism. Cotroni tried to rally his remaining loyalists to authorize retaliation that would restore the balance of fear. But the retaliation never came with the force needed to change the trajectory. Small-scale attacks, minor figures killed, nothing that struck at the Rizzuto leadership directly. The Sicilians had anticipated this. They'd planned for counterattacks and had already established security protocols, with key figures taking precautions and letting their successful strike speak for itself. The message wasn't just that the Sicilians could kill, it was that they could kill with impunity, that they'd calculated the risks and decided the Calabrian response would be insufficient. And they were right. Over the next 2 years, the Calabrian organization hemorrhaged power. Rocco Violi, Paolo's brother, tried to maintain control. He was careful, more cautious than Paolo had been. He understood the danger and took precautions. None of it mattered. On October the 17th, 1980, Rocco Violi was killed by a sniper as he walked in his own neighborhood. The shot came from distance, fired with precision. Violi was dead before the sound of the rifle shot faded. The sniper killing was significant for what it revealed about the evolution of organized crime tactics. Traditional mafia violence was close range. Pistols, shotguns, personal confrontation. The use of a rifle from distance demonstrated a willingness to adopt whatever methods were effective, regardless of tradition. The Calabrians were still thinking in terms of respect and vendetta. The killers were thinking in terms of strategic elimination and market control. By 1981, the war was effectively over. The Cotroni organization still existed on paper, but its operational control had evaporated. Vincenzo Cotroni himself retreated from active leadership, increasingly focused on avoiding law enforcement prosecution. The CECO investigations had generated massive documentation of organized crime operations, and police were making arrests across the organization. Cotroni spent his final years fighting legal battles, trying to preserve what remained of his empire while watching the Sicilians consolidate power he'd once considered his birthright. He died in 1984, and with him died the last vestiges of Calabrian dominance in Montreal organized crime. The Rizzuto family, Nicolo and his son Vito, emerged from the war as the undisputed leaders of Montreal's mafia. They'd won not through superior numbers, but through superior strategy. They'd identified that the future of organized crime lay in international narcotics trafficking rather than traditional local rackets, and they'd positioned themselves to exploit that shift. They'd recognized that the old mafia structure was brittle, vulnerable to strategic strikes against its leadership rather than requiring total organizational destruction. And they'd executed their campaign with patience, waiting years between major attacks when necessary, never rushing into action that would expose them to retaliation. They couldn't survive. What they built was fundamentally different from what had come before. The Cotroni organization had been local, focused on Montreal area rackets that required physical presence and constant enforcement. The Rizzuto organization became international, with connections stretching from Sicily to Venezuela to Colombia. In the late 1970s and increasingly through the 1980s, cocaine trafficking emerged as the dominant revenue source for the organization. While exact figures are difficult to verify, law enforcement estimates suggest that successful trafficking operations could generate profits many times larger than traditional gambling, loan sharking, and protection rackets combined. The scale wasn't just larger, it was categorically different. The Rizzuto organization was operating as a multinational criminal corporation with diversified revenue streams, sophisticated financial structures, and international strategic relationships. Vito Rizzuto became the face of this new empire. Born in 1946, he'd grown up watching his father navigate the dangerous politics of Montreal organized crime. He'd learned patience, calculation, and the importance of legitimate business fronts. By the mid-1980s, Vito was running an organization that law enforcement believed touched hundreds of millions of dollars in illegal trade annually. Cocaine from South America moved through Montreal to New York, Toronto, and across North America. Money moved in the opposite direction, laundered through real estate purchases, construction projects, and carefully structured offshore transactions. Violence was used sparingly, strategically, only when necessary to protect the organization's core interests. This wasn't chaos. It was business, conducted with ruthless efficiency. The impact extended beyond Montreal. The Rizzuto victory demonstrated that ethnic solidarity could overcome institutional power in organized crime. Sicilian mafia families across North America watched Montreal's transformation and learned tactical lessons about challenging entrenched leadership. The war showed that strategic violence, carefully targeted eliminations of key leaders, could topple organizations that seemed unassailable. It showed that controlling the most lucrative criminal market, which by the 1980s meant cocaine trafficking, provided resources that dwarfed traditional rackets. And it showed that adaptation, the willingness to abandon old methods and embrace new opportunities, determined survival in a rapidly evolving criminal economy. Law enforcement struggled to adapt to what the Rizzutos had built. Traditional investigative methods, surveillance of social clubs, wiretaps of phone conversations, informants within the organization still worked. But the scale of the operation overwhelmed local police resources. The CECO investigations had documented the structure of Montreal organized crime, but documentation didn't translate to successful prosecutions. The Rizzutos had learned from the Cotrones' mistakes. They compartmentalized operations, used layers of intermediaries, and maintained distance between leadership and street-level crime. Proving that Vito Rizzuto ordered a specific criminal act required evidence that was extraordinarily difficult to obtain. The drug money changed everything about how organized crime functioned. In the 1950s and 60s, mafia families generated substantial income through diverse local rackets. By the mid-1980s, organizations involved in international drug trafficking were operating on an entirely different financial scale. That money bought political influence through strategic corruption of officials at every level. It bought legal protection through retaining the best criminal defense attorneys. It bought operational security through sophisticated counter-surveillance technology and professional money laundering. And it bought loyalty, because organizations like the Rizzutos could pay their associates far more than any legitimate employment or traditional criminal activity could generate. This created a system that was simultaneously more powerful and more fragile than traditional mafia structures. More powerful because the financial resources were unprecedented. More fragile because the entire operation depended on maintaining control of specific trafficking routes and relationships with South American suppliers. Lose those relationships and the revenue disappeared. This vulnerability wasn't theoretical. In later years, the Rizzuto organization would face internal challenges, conflicts with other criminal groups, and law enforcement operations that specifically targeted their trafficking infrastructure. But in the mid-1980s, in the immediate aftermath of the Montreal Mafia War, the Rizzutos' position seemed unassailable. The human cost of the war was measured in more than the direct victims. Paolo Violi left a widow and children who had to navigate life after their father's assassination. Rocco Violi's death meant more grieving relatives, more shattered families. But the broader impact touched hundreds of people connected to the organizations. Associates who lost income when the Calabrian rackets collapsed. Legitimate business owners who'd paid protection to the Cotrones and now had to establish relationships with new powers. Families of lower-level criminals who were killed in the peripheral violence that accompanied the major assassinations. War and organized crime isn't clean. It ripples outward, destroying lives and livelihoods far beyond the principles involved. There was also a cultural dimension to the conflict that often gets overlooked in discussions focused purely on criminal operations. The Calabrian and Sicilian communities in Montreal had different histories, different dialects, different traditions. The Mafia War reinforced and exploited those differences. Calabrian immigrants who'd built social clubs and mutual aid societies watched their community leadership destroyed. Sicilian immigrants saw their cultural institutions become mechanisms of criminal power. For many immigrants who'd come to Canada seeking legitimate opportunity, the war was a source of shame, their ethnic communities being defined by violence and criminality rather than by the restaurants, businesses, and families they'd built. The Montreal Mafia War also revealed the limits of law enforcement power in the face of well-organized criminal enterprises. The Cyclical investigations produced thousands of pages of documentation, identified key figures, mapped organizational structures, and revealed operational details. But most of the major figures in the war were never successfully prosecuted for their roles in it. Paolo Violi's killers were never identified by police. Rocco Violi's shooter was never caught. The strategic planners behind the Sicilian campaign, Nicolo and Vito Rizzuto, were never charged in connection with the murders that gave them power. This wasn't because police were incompetent or corrupt, though corruption certainly existed. It was because the Rizzutos operated with sophisticated operational security that kept them insulated from direct evidence. Witnesses didn't testify. Physical evidence was minimal. The killings were professional enough that forensics provided limited leads. And even when police suspected specific individuals, suspicion wasn't proof. Canadian criminal law required evidence beyond a reasonable doubt to convict. The Rizzutos understood this and structured their operations accordingly. Orders were given verbally, never written. Communication happened through intermediaries. Money moved through complex routes that obscured its origin. The organization functioned like a corporation designed specifically to defeat law enforcement investigation, which is exactly what it was. This created a frustrating dynamic for investigators. They knew what was happening. They knew who was responsible. But knowing and proving were different standards, and the gap between them could be insurmountable. Police files from the era show the frustration. Reports documenting meetings between known criminals, surveillance photographs showing associates entering restaurants together, financial analysis revealing suspicious transactions, all circumstantial, all insufficient for prosecution. The Rizzutos could operate openly because they'd mastered the art of staying just beyond the reach of criminal charges. The war also demonstrated how organized crime adapts to enforcement pressure. When CECO investigations made traditional operations more dangerous, criminal organizations shifted focus to international trafficking that was harder for Canadian police to monitor. When wiretaps threatened security, they moved to in-person meetings and coded language. When informants became a risk, they compartmentalized operations so that lower-level members knew only their specific roles. Every law enforcement tactic generated a criminal counter-tactic, an evolutionary arms race where both sides continuously adapted. This pattern would continue for decades. The Rizzuto organization survived and thrived through the 1980s and 90s, becoming one of the most powerful criminal enterprises in North America. Vito Rizzuto became a figure of almost mythical status, the quiet don who avoided publicity while controlling a vast criminal empire. He was finally arrested in 2004 and extradited to the United States in 2006 to face charges related to murders in New York. He served 10 years in American prisons and returned to Montreal in 2012, only to die of natural causes in 2013. His death created a power vacuum that sparked another round of violence, demonstrating that the fundamental dynamics exposed in the 1970s war, ethnic tensions, generational conflicts, the dangers of succession in criminal organizations never truly disappear. The violence that followed Vito's imprisonment revealed the Rizzuto organization's vulnerability. In 2009, his son Nick Jr. was killed in a brazen daylight shooting. In 2010, Nicolo Rizzuto, The patriarch who'd immigrated from Sicily in 1954 and lived to see his family dominate Montreal's underworld was shot and killed by a sniper through the window of his own home. The organization that had built its power through strategic assassination now faced the same tactics from rivals who'd studied their methods and identified their weaknesses. The cyclical nature of organized crime power was brutally demonstrated. The Montreal Mafia War wasn't unique in organized crime history, but it was exemplary. It showed how strategic thinking could overcome numerical superiority. It showed how positioning yourself to control emerging criminal markets could destabilize existing power structures. It showed how ethnic identity could be weaponized in organizational conflict. And it showed how violence, when applied precisely and strategically, rather than chaotically, could reshape an entire criminal landscape. These lessons were absorbed by criminal organizations worldwide, studied by law enforcement, and debated by academics trying to understand how illegal economies function. What made Montreal particularly significant was its role as a crossroads. The city's geography, a major port with access to both the Atlantic and the North American interior, made it strategically valuable for international trafficking. Its large Italian immigrant population provided the cultural infrastructure that organized crime needs to function. Its proximity to the United States created opportunities for cross-border operations, and its complex relationship between federal, provincial, and municipal law enforcement created gaps that sophisticated criminals could exploit. The Rizzutos understood these advantages and built an organization specifically designed to capitalize on Montreal's unique position. The war also highlighted the role of violence as communication in organized crime. When Paolo Violi was killed, the gunman could have killed everyone in the café. They didn't. They killed Violi and left everyone else unharmed. The message wasn't, we're violent and chaotic. It was, we're precise, we're competent, and we can reach anyone. When Rocco Violi was killed by sniper, the method itself sent a message about capability and reach. Each killing was designed not just to eliminate an individual, but to communicate organizational strength and operational sophistication. This psychological dimension of violence is often underappreciated in discussions of organized crime, but it was central to the strategic campaign that destroyed the Calabrian leadership. The economic transformation drove everything. Traditional organized crime operations generated substantial revenue, but were limited by geography and the need for constant physical enforcement. International drug trafficking, which became the dominant focus for the Rizzuto organization in the late 1970s and 1980s, operated on an entirely different scale. While precise revenue figures are impossible to verify, criminal organizations don't file public financial reports. Law enforcement estimates and subsequent prosecutions suggest that successful trafficking operations generated profits that dwarf traditional rackets. This wasn't a marginal improvement. It was a fundamental shift in criminal economics that changed what was possible. Organizations with access to drug trafficking revenue could bribe judges, purchase political influence, retain the best legal counsel, and still have vast sums left for operational expenses and profit distribution. Traditional mafia economics couldn't compete with that. This created the conditions for what came next. Not just Rizzuto dominance, but the transformation of Montreal into a hub for international criminal finance. Drug money needed laundering, and Montreal developed sophisticated infrastructure for it. Real estate purchased through shell companies, construction projects that inflated costs to justify payments, import-export businesses that created paper trails for non-existent legitimate transactions, offshore accounts and Caribbean tax havens. The techniques weren't unique to Montreal, but the scale and sophistication were exceptional. By the 1990s, financial investigators estimated that billions of dollars in criminal proceeds were moving through Montreal annually, touching banks, law firms, accounting practices, and real estate agencies. Some of that involvement was knowing and corrupt. Much of it was inadvertent, legitimate professionals serving clients without understanding the source of funds. The Rizzutos had built a system that co-opted the legitimate economy. There's a historical irony in how this played out. The Cotroni organization had prided itself on maintaining certain boundaries, operating within understood rules, limiting violence to preserve stability, maintaining relationships with legitimate community leaders who could provide political protection. The Rizzutos destroyed that system through strategic violence, then rebuilt something that looked on the surface like respectability. Vito Rizzuto attended charity events, donated to hospitals, sponsored youth sports teams. He presented himself as a successful businessman, not a criminal. But that respectability was built on the same foundation of violence that had killed the Violis. The difference was packaging, not substance. Law enforcement eventually adapted, but it took decades. International cooperation agreements made it harder for criminals to hide in one jurisdiction while operating in another. Financial tracking technology made money laundering more difficult and more dangerous. Witness protection programs convinced some organization members to testify. RICO statutes in the United States and similar conspiracy laws in Canada allowed prosecutors to charge organizational leaders for crimes they'd ordered rather than personally committed. These tools gradually eroded the Rizzuto organization's operational security. But they came too late to prevent the transformation of Montreal organized crime, too late to stop the consolidation of Sicilian power, too late to save the Calabrian organization from extinction. The Montreal Mafia War was a case study in how power shifts in illegal economies. Traditional organizations grow complacent, assuming their institutional advantages are permanent. Challenger organizations identify and exploit weaknesses, often by recognizing economic opportunities the established powers have missed. Strategic violence becomes necessary because illegal organizations can't resolve disputes through legitimate mechanisms like courts or arbitration. And the outcome is determined not by who starts strongest, but by who adapts fastest to changing conditions. The Cotrones were stronger in 1970. The Rizzutos were smarter about where the criminal economy was headed. That difference decided everything. For the people of Montreal, the war was largely invisible. Tourists walked through old Montreal, admired the architecture, ate at restaurants, and never knew that a criminal war was reshaping the city's underworld. Residents lived in Saint-Léonard or Rivière-des-Prairies, aware that organized crime existed but insulated from its violence. The killings made headlines, but they were presented as isolated incidents rather than connected strategic campaigns. This invisibility was deliberate. Both the Calabrians and Sicilians understood that public violence attracted law enforcement attention that could destroy their operations. The war was fought quietly, professionally, with violence targeted precisely at organizational leadership rather than scattered across the civilian population. But for those inside the world of organized crime, the made members, the associates, the family members, the war was total. Everyone had to choose sides or flee. Neutrality wasn't an option after Pietro Sciarra's murder demonstrated that mediators would be eliminated. Associates who'd worked for the Cotrones for decades had to decide whether to abandon those relationships and pledge loyalty to the Sicilians or risk becoming targets themselves. Some fled Montreal entirely, relocating to Toronto or back to Italy. Some tried to wait out the conflict, hoping the Calabrians would rally. Most eventually accepted Rizzuto authority because the alternative was irrelevance or death. This consolidation created a criminal organization with unprecedented internal discipline. The Cotroni organization had always dealt with rivalries, territorial disputes, and challenges to authority. The Rizzuto organization eliminated those problems through the crucible of war. Everyone who joined had made an explicit choice to back the Sicilians against the Calabrians. That shared experience created loyalty that was harder to break than traditional mafia oaths. When the Rizzuto leadership gave orders, people followed not just because of the threat of violence, but because the organization had proven its strategic competence through victory. The Montreal Mafia War became the founding mythology of the Rizzuto organization, the origin story that explained and justified their power. The international implications extended beyond North America. Sicilian mafia families saw what the Rizzutos had accomplished and recognized the broader lesson that Sicilian criminal organizations could compete with and defeat established powers in new territories through strategic planning and willingness to adapt to new criminal markets. This emboldened Sicilian expansion into other markets. The 'Ndrangheta, the Calabrian Mafia, watched their Montreal cousins get destroyed and learned that traditional methods were insufficient against innovative, aggressive competitors. These lessons rippled across the global organized crime landscape throughout the 1980s and 90s, influencing how criminal organizations thought about expansion, competition, and strategic violence. The role of family in the Rizzuto organization was both strength and vulnerability. Nicolo and Vito operated as father and son, which created deep trust and efficient decision-making. But it also meant that the organization's continuity depended on biological succession. When Nick Jr. was killed in 2009 and Nicolo was killed in 2010, the organization lost a clear succession line that had given it stability. The Montreal Mafia War had shown how challenger organizations could exploit succession crises in established powers. Decades later, the Rizzutos faced the same vulnerability they'd once exploited, and other criminal groups launched their own wars trying to seize what the Rizzutos had built. This cyclical nature of organized crime power is one of the war's most important lessons. Victory is never permanent. Every dominant organization eventually faces challengers who've studied its methods, identified its weaknesses, and calculated that the timing is right for confrontation. The Cotronis thought their power was permanent in 1970. The Rizzutos dominated for 3 decades but ultimately faced the same forces that had destroyed their predecessors. Criminal empires rise and fall with every generation, constrained by the same forces that shape legitimate businesses: market changes, technological evolution, generational turnover, and competitive pressure. The difference is that in illegal markets, these transitions are negotiated through violence rather than through bankruptcy courts or hostile takeovers. The psychology of power and vulnerability deserves examination. Paolo Violi knew he was in danger. He'd seen associates killed, understood that the Sicilians wanted him dead. Yet he continued his routines, continued operating from familiar locations, continued behaving as though his reputation provided protection. This reflects a cognitive failure common in power struggles: the inability to fully internalize that the rules have fundamentally changed, that the power dynamics that had been successfully navigated for decades were now obsolete. Violi understood the danger intellectually, but not viscerally. Not enough to abandon the routines that defined his identity and position. That failure cost him his life. Similarly, Vincenzo Cotroni's hesitation to authorize decisive violence against the Rizzutos reflected a psychological truth about aging leaders. Cotroni had built his empire through calculated risk-taking in his 30s and 40s. By his 60s, he'd become risk-averse, more concerned with preserving what he'd built than with taking the aggressive action necessary to eliminate existential threats. This evolution is normal and human. It's also fatal in environments where hesitation equals vulnerability. The Rizzutos recognized this weakness and exploited it, moving decisively while the Calabrian leadership debated and delayed. These psychological dimensions are often missing from discussions of organized crime, which tend to focus on structure, economics, and violence. But organizations are made of people, and people carry psychological limitations that affect strategic decisions. Overconfidence, risk aversion, inability to adapt to changing circumstances, misreading of opponents' capabilities. These human factors determine the war's outcome as much as economics or firepower. The Rizzutos succeeded partly because they were better strategists, and partly because they were younger, hungrier, and less constrained by the psychological baggage of established power. The legacy of the Montreal Mafia War continues to shape Canadian organized crime. The Rizzuto organization's methods, international trafficking networks, sophisticated money laundering, strategic violence, compartmentalized operations, became the template for criminal organizations across Canada. Other ethnic organized crime groups, Chinese triads, Eastern European networks, outlaw motorcycle gangs, studied what the Rizzutos had built and adapted those lessons to their own operations. Law enforcement agencies developed specialized units focused specifically on combating international trafficking organizations. The war's influence extended far beyond the individuals directly involved, becoming a defining event in Canadian criminal history. For historians and criminologists, the Montreal Mafia War offers a case study in organizational conflict that's unusually well documented. CECO investigations generated extensive public records. Police files documented surveillance operations. Court proceedings created transcripts and evidence exhibits. Journalists covered the killings and their context. Academic researchers studied the organizational dynamics. This documentation makes it possible to analyze the war with a level of detail rarely available for criminal conflicts. We can trace the strategic patterns, identify the turning points, and examine the consequences with reasonable confidence in the historical record. Yet mysteries remain. Who actually pulled the trigger on Paolo Violi? Who fired the sniper shot that killed Rocco Violi? What specific conversations led Nicolo and Vito Rizzuto to decide the time had come for war? These questions remain unanswered because the participants who knew the truth either died or maintained omerta, the mafia code of silence. The strategic outline is clear from documented events and their consequences. The tactical details remain obscure. This combination of documentation and mystery is characteristic of organized crime history. We know what happened, but we rarely know everything about how it happened. The Montreal Mafia War ended in 1980 with Rocco Violi's assassination, but its effects continue. The Rizzuto organization dominated Montreal organized crime until internal conflicts and law enforcement pressure weakened it in the 2000s. The trafficking routes they established continue to funnel drugs through Montreal. The money laundering infrastructure they pioneered still processes criminal proceeds. The strategic lessons they demonstrated, that control of the most lucrative criminal market determines power, that targeted violence can topple established organizations, that ethnic solidarity can overcome numerical disadvantages, remain relevant to every criminal organization operating today. The war's end was just the beginning of a new era in Canadian organized crime, an era defined by international trafficking, massive financial flows, and sophisticated criminal enterprises built on lessons learned from what the Rizzutos had accomplished. In the end, the Montreal Mafia War was about a fundamental question that extends beyond organized crime. How does power change hands in environments where formal rules don't exist? In legitimate business, power shifts through market competition, boardroom coups, or legal challenges. In organized crime, it shifts through strategic violence and the calculation of who can inflict more cost on their opponents than they can absorb themselves. The Rizzutos answered that question decisively. They calculated correctly that the Calabrian organization, despite its institutional advantages, couldn't survive the strategic elimination of its key leaders. They executed that strategy with patience and precision, and they built an empire on the foundation of their victory. That empire has now largely dissolved, victim to the same forces that destroyed the Catrones: internal rivalries, aggressive competitors, law enforcement pressure, and the inevitable generational turnover that erodes institutional power. But for 3 decades, from 1980 to 2010, the Rizzuto organization stood as proof that strategic competence could build criminal power that rivaled legitimate corporations in scope and sophistication. The Montreal Mafia War was the crucible that forged that organization, the foundational violence that made everything that followed possible. Understanding that war means understanding how illegal economies function, how criminal organizations rise and fall, and how strategic violence shapes power in environments where law offers no protection and only strength determines survival.